They say your life can change in an instant, but I never truly understood that until the moment I pulled into my driveway and saw them standing there. It was just another Tuesday, or so I thought. I'd left work early to surprise my wife, Mia, with a night out. I'd planned everything: a reservation at her favorite restaurant, tickets to the play she'd been dying to see. It was supposed to be a night to remind her how much I still loved her after all these years. Instead, I was the one who got the surprise. Ryan Carter, my best friend, or so I thought, stood on my driveway with his arms slung around Mia's shoulders like he owned her. Like he'd always owned her. The man was grinning from ear to ear, his smile smug and self-satisfied. And Mia? She looked radiant, dressed in that yellow sundress I'd always loved on her, her hair flowing over her shoulders. She didn't look at me, not even once. Ryan looked me dead in the eye and said it, loud and clear, "This is our home now." For a moment, I thought I must have misheard him. Surely, he wasn't standing on my driveway, holding my wife, saying those words. But the triumphant gleam in his eyes told me otherwise. My chest tightened as the meaning of his statement sank in. This wasn't a joke. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was betrayal, raw, intentional, and devastating. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. What could I even say? They had already turned their backs to me, walking toward my front door, their heads bent together like they were sharing some private joke. My feet felt glued to the ground as I watched them disappear inside. Inside my house. Inside our house. I stood there for what felt like hours, the cool evening air chilling me to the bone. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, and my heart pounded so loudly I could barely think. How long had this been going on? How had I missed the signs? Mia and I had been married for 15 years. We had a daughter, Chloe, who adored her mother. We had built a life together, brick by brick. And now, in one moment, that life had been reduced to rubble. The worst part was that it wasn't just Mia who had betrayed me. It was Ryan, my best friend, the man I'd trusted like a brother. We'd been through everything together: college, careers, weddings, kids. He'd been the best man at my wedding, for God's sake. And now, he was walking into my home as if it were his own. My mind raced, replaying every interaction I'd ever had with the two of them. Had there been signs? Subtle glances, secret smiles, lingering touches? I thought back to the dinner parties we'd hosted, the late-night drinks when Ryan would stay long after the other guests had left. Had they been laughing at me this whole time? Treating me like a fool while they carried on behind my back? A wave of nausea hit me, and I bent over, gripping my knees to keep from collapsing. My entire world had just been turned upside down, and I didn't know how to make sense of it. But one thing was clear. I couldn't let them get away with this. My phone buzzed in my pocket, snapping me out of my spiral. It was Chloe, texting from her friend Rachel's house to let me know she'd be home later. Thank God she wasn't here to see this. How could I explain it to her? How could I tell my teenage daughter that her mother had betrayed us, that the man she called Uncle Ryan was now something much worse? I took a deep breath and straightened up, forcing myself to think clearly. Storming into the house and confronting them wasn't an option. Not yet. I needed a plan. I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with. How long had this been going on? How deep did their betrayal run? I walked slowly toward the house, my hands still trembling with barely contained rage. The porch light illuminated the familiar welcome mat, the one Mia had insisted on buying because it added character. I stared at it for a moment, realizing that nothing about this house felt welcoming anymore. When I stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was their laughter. It was coming from the kitchen. My kitchen? I could hear Ryan's voice, smooth and confident, saying something I couldn't quite make out. Mia's laugh followed, light and carefree, like she didn't have a care in the world, like she hadn't just destroyed our family. I didn't go to the kitchen. I couldn't. Instead, I went upstairs to our bedroom, the one Mia and I had shared for so many years. The bed was unmade, the sheets rumpled in a way that suddenly felt intimate, almost indecent. I felt like a stranger in my own home, an intruder in the life I'd worked so hard to build. As I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, a thought crept into my mind. A dark, dangerous thought. They wouldn't walk out of this house together. Not if I had anything to say about it. I didn't know what that meant yet. I didn't have a plan, just a simmering rage that demanded an outlet. But one thing was certain. I wouldn't let them win. They had taken everything from me. My home, my wife, my best friend. And now, it was my turn to take something from them. I stayed in the bedroom for hours, listening to their voices drift through the house. They were too comfortable, too confident. They thought I was weak. They thought I would roll over and let them have their way. But they were wrong. By the time the house fell silent, I had made up my mind. They might think they owned this home now, but they had no idea who they were dealing with. I was going to make them regret ever stepping onto my driveway. And when I was done, they wouldn't just lose each other. They'd lose everything. The following morning, I woke up to a sound that had once been so familiar it felt like part of the house. Mia's humming. It came from the kitchen, light and cheerful, as if she didn't have a care in the world. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself it was all a bad dream. But then I heard his voice, deep and smug, calling out to her. "Coffee's ready, babe." It wasn't a dream. This was my new reality. I pulled myself out of bed, every step feeling heavier than the last, and headed downstairs. The sight that greeted me was a punch to the gut. There they were, Mia and Ryan, sitting at my kitchen table, drinking coffee out of the mugs we'd bought on a family trip to the Grand Canyon. Mia was wearing one of her silk robes, the one I'd given her for our 10th anniversary, and Ryan had the audacity to sit there in his boxers, like he owned the place. I wanted to scream, to throw them both out right then and there. But I didn't. Instead, I did what I'd been doing since yesterday. I stayed quiet, observing, planning. I knew if I acted out of pure emotion, I'd lose. And I couldn't afford to lose. "Morning, Daniel," Ryan said with a grin, lifting his mug in a mock toast. "Coffee?" "No, thanks," I muttered, brushing past them to grab a glass of water. I could feel Mia's eyes on me, but she didn't say anything. That hurt more than it should have. As I leaned against the counter, pretending to check my phone, I listened to their conversation. Ryan was talking about his plans for the day. "I'll head to the gym, maybe swing by the office later," while Mia nodded along, completely at ease. It was like they had already settled into a routine, as if I was the intruder in their home. I clenched my jaw and swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. Let them play house, I thought. They wouldn't be here for long. Later that day, Chloe came home from her friend Rachel's house. She burst through the door with her usual teenage energy, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her phone in her hand. She didn't notice Ryan at first, but when she did, she froze. "Uncle Ryan," she said, confusion flickering across her face. "What are you doing here?" Ryan flashed her that charming smile he used on everyone. "Hey, kiddo. Just helping your mom out with a few things." Chloe looked at me, her eyebrows furrowed, searching for an explanation. I couldn't give her one. Not yet. "How was your day, sweetheart?" I asked, deflecting. She hesitated, then shrugged. "Fine, I guess." Her eyes lingered on Ryan for a moment longer before she headed upstairs. I could tell she wasn't buying his excuse, and that gave me a small sense of relief. Chloe was smart, too smart to let this slide. I'd have to tell her the truth eventually, but for now, I needed her to stay out of it. She didn't deserve to be dragged into this mess. As the days passed, Mia and Ryan started making themselves more at home. Mia rearranged the living room, moving furniture around as if to erase the life we'd built together. Ryan added his own touch, bringing in gym equipment that cluttered the garage and setting up a fancy espresso machine on the kitchen counter. I watched it all with quiet fury, taking mental notes of every change they made. It wasn't just about the physical space. It was about the way they carried themselves. The way Ryan walked through the house with that smug confidence, like he'd won some grand prize. The way Mia laughed at his jokes, a sound that used to belong to me. Then there was Angela, Mia's best friend, who started visiting more often. Angela had always been the fun friend, the one who encouraged Mia to let loose and take risks. She acted like nothing was wrong, like this arrangement was completely normal. But I saw the way she avoided my gaze, the way her laughter sounded forced when I was in the room. She knew. She'd known all along. One evening, Angela pulled me aside while Mia and Ryan were in the backyard. "Daniel, I know this is hard, she said, her voice low. But maybe it's time to let go. Let go? I repeated, my tone icy. Of my wife? My home? My family? I'm just saying, maybe this is what's best for everyone. I stared at her, my blood boiling. For everyone? Or just for them? Angela didn't answer. She gave me a pitying look and walked away. I wanted to yell after her, to tell her she had no idea what she was talking about. But what would have been the point? She'd already made her choice. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what Chloe had said earlier. She'd asked why I wasn't sleeping in the same room as Mom anymore. I told her it was just temporary, that I needed space to think. She seemed to accept that, but I could see the worry in her eyes. I couldn't let this continue. Mia and Ryan thought they could just take over my life, but they were wrong. This was my home, my family, and I was going to do whatever it took to remind them of that. They might think they were the new residents, but they had no idea what was coming. I didn't sleep much these days. Most nights, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the past 15 years, searching for clues I'd missed. Was it at that barbecue last summer, when Ryan and Mia had spent a little too much time laughing together by the grill? Or was it years earlier, during one of our annual New Year's parties, when Ryan had insisted on helping her clean up after the guests left? The signs were there, weren't they? I had just been too blind, or too trusting, to see them. But now I knew the truth, and ignorance was no longer an option. I spent hours combing through phone records, email archives, and bank statements. I became a man possessed, fueled by equal parts rage and heartbreak. And the more I uncovered, the clearer the picture became. This wasn't just some impulsive fling. This affair had been going on for years. It started small. A series of suspicious texts between Mia and Ryan caught my eye. I remembered seeing his name pop up on her phone once or twice in the past, but I brushed it off. After all, he was my best friend. Why would I suspect anything? But now, those texts took on a whole new meaning. The messages were vague, carefully worded, as if they were trying not to leave a trail. But one line stood out to me: "Can't wait for our next weekend." Last time was unforgettable. My stomach churned as I read it, my hands trembling with anger. Weekend? Last time? What weekend? I thought about all the times Mia had told me she was visiting her sister or taking a girls' trip. How many of those trips had really been with Ryan? How many lies had I swallowed without question? I saved the texts, forwarding them to myself as evidence. Not that I needed more proof. Mia's actions had already said everything. But still, I wanted to know everything. If I was going to confront them, I needed every detail. The next piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source: Ryan's ex-wife, Hannah Blake. Hannah and Ryan had split up a few years ago under murky circumstances. At the time, I'd sympathized with Ryan, believing his claims that Hannah had been too controlling and impossible to live with. But now, I wondered if there was more to the story. I reached out to Hannah under the pretense of catching up, though my real motive was far from friendly. When we met for coffee, she looked wary but agreed to talk. "I always thought you were the smarter one," she said, stirring her cappuccino. "Guess I was wrong." Her words stung, but I bit my tongue. "How long?" I asked, cutting straight to the point. Hannah sighed, leaning back in her chair. "How long what, Daniel? How long have Ryan and Mia been involved?" Her eyes widened slightly, and for a moment, I thought she might deny it. But then she shook her head, a bitter smile creeping onto her face. "Years," she said flatly. "I don't know exactly how many, but it started before Ryan and I split up. That much I'm sure of." My heart sank. I'd suspected it, but hearing the confirmation was like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you tell me?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Why didn't you see it yourself? It was right in front of you, Daniel. But you were too busy being the good husband, the good friend, to notice." I had no response to that. She was right, after all. Before she left, Hannah handed me a small envelope. "This might help," she said cryptically. I opened it later that night to find a stack of photos, grainy but damning. There they were, Mia and Ryan, sitting too close at a cafe, walking hand in hand at a park, even kissing in front of what looked like a hotel. It was all the proof I needed. The final nail in the coffin came from my own research. Late one night, I discovered that Ryan had been embezzling funds from his company, a detail that wasn't entirely surprising, given his arrogance. What was surprising was how Mia's name appeared on several transactions. They weren't just cheating, they were partners in crime. The realization made my blood boil. This wasn't just about love or lust. It was about power. They had built their secret world together, funded by lies and deceit, while I'd been left in the dark. But no longer. Armed with this information, I began to set the stage for my revenge. I didn't confront them outright. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, I started planting seeds of doubt, whispering truths into their fabricated reality to make it crumble from within. I left one of the photos where Mia could find it, folded neatly on her bedside table. I made a passing comment about Ryan's business troubles during dinner, watching the flicker of panic in his eyes. Every move I made was calculated, every word deliberate. I wanted them to feel the walls closing in, to know that their little house of lies was about to collapse. Because it wasn't just about exposing the affair anymore. It was about reclaiming what was mine, or at the very least, making sure they could never take it away from me again. They had built their empire on my trust. Now, I was going to burn it to the ground. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. I disagreed. Revenge, for me, was a dish best served methodically, with every ingredient carefully measured and prepared. I wasn't going to rush this. No, I wanted them to feel it. Slowly, deeply, and completely. It began with a simple idea. Turn their comfort into chaos. They had taken over my home, so I would make sure it was anything but homey for them. I pretended to play along, to be the accommodating third wheel, all while planting the seeds of my plan. First, I approached my colleague Elliot Grant. Elliot wasn't just a coworker. He was a tech wizard who could hack, code, and rewire anything with a plug. Over beers one evening, I pitched the idea to him as if it were a joke. Imagine rigging my house with a security system so advanced, it could practically babysit my unwelcome guests, I said with a forced laugh. Elliot raised an eyebrow. Babysit, huh? Or spy? I grinned. What's the difference? He laughed, but I could see the gears turning in his head. Within a week, Elliot was at my house, helping me install a security upgrade. Cameras went into every corner, microphones were hidden in plain sight, and motion detectors were programmed to send me alerts the moment anyone stepped into specific rooms. Why the overkill? Elliot asked as he drilled into a wall. Let's just say I want to know every move they make, I replied, keeping my tone casual. Elliot didn't press further. Maybe he sensed there was more to the story, but he didn't ask. That was the thing about Elliot. He was curious, but he knew when to back off. While Elliot worked on the hardware, I focused on the psychological side of things. Ryan and Mia were smug, too smug. They thought they'd won, that they could waltz into my life and take everything from me. I decided it was time to plant some doubt. It started small. I'd accidentally leave old family photos lying around. Pictures of Mia and me smiling on vacation, holding Chloe as a baby, standing in front of the house we'd built together. I made sure to leave them in places Mia couldn't ignore. The bathroom counter, her nightstand, even tucked into one of her favorite books. The first time she saw one, I caught her staring at it for a moment too long. Her fingers brushed over the image of us at the beach, her face a mix of nostalgia and guilt. Ryan walked in, saw her holding the photo, and snatched it away. Why are you holding on to this crap? He snapped, tossing the photo into the trash. I didn't say a word, but I could see the cracks forming. Next, I turned my attention to Ryan. He was the more arrogant of the two, which made him easier to manipulate. One evening, as we sat in the living room pretending to watch TV, I casually mentioned a rumor I'd heard. Funny thing, I said, swirling my glass of whiskey. I was talking to an old colleague, and your name came up. Something about financial discrepancies at your old job. Ryan's jaw tightened, but he kept his tone light. People love to talk, he said. Jealousy, I guess. I said, taking a sip. Maybe. Or maybe it's something more. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel the tension radiating off him, and I knew I'd struck a nerve. The piece de resistance of my trap came in the form of the basement. It was dark, damp, and rarely used, which made it the perfect place to set the stage for what was to come. I began renovating the basement, claiming it needed work to increase the home's value. Ryan, ever the opportunist, offered to help. "Anything to make the place feel more like ours," he said with a smirk. I resisted the urge to punch him right there and then. Over the next few days, I had Elliot install a few additional features in the basement: hidden cameras, a reinforced door, and a remote-controlled lock. Ryan had no idea what he was helping me build, and that made it all the sweeter. The final piece of the puzzle was Mia. She had been quieter lately, less confident in her role as queen of the castle. The photos, the subtle reminders of our life together, had started to chip away at her resolve. But she was still holding on to Ryan, clinging to him like a life raft in a storm. One evening, I caught her standing in the hallway, staring at the closed door to the basement. She turned to me, her eyes wary. "What's down there?" she asked. I shrugged. "Just some upgrades." "Upgrades for what?" I met her gaze, my expression unreadable. "For us." She didn't ask any more questions, but I could see the unease in her eyes. She was starting to sense that something wasn't right. Good. By the time the trap was fully set, the house was a minefield of tension and hidden truths. Ryan and Mia were still playing house, but the cracks were growing deeper. They thought they were in control, but they had no idea the game had shifted. Because this wasn't their home, it was mine. And soon, they'd realize they were nothing more than unwelcome guests overstaying their welcome. The best part? They wouldn't see it coming. Not until it was too late. It didn't take long for the cracks in their perfect little world to grow into deep, gaping chasms. The smug smiles, the laughter, the overconfident struts through my house. All of it began to falter as I turned the screws ever so slightly. Every move I made was subtle, deliberate. I didn't need to rush. I wanted them to unravel on their own. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. The first sign was the way Mia and Ryan started snapping at each other. At first, it was small things. Ryan complaining about how Mia never refilled the coffee pods. Mia rolling her eyes when Ryan spent too much time at the gym. But soon, the bickering escalated. One night, I overheard them arguing in the living room. I had installed microphones there, hidden in the vents, so their every word was piped directly to the headphones I kept in my bedroom. I lay on my bed, listening to their voices rise. "You're always on your damn phone," Ryan said, his voice sharp. "Who are you even talking to?" "None of your business," Mia shot back. "Don't act like you're some saint. I know what you've been up to." "Oh, so now you're accusing me," he snapped. Maybe I should have stayed with someone who actually knows how to keep her mouth shut. There was a loud crash, something breaking. I smiled. Let them tear each other apart. The tension wasn't confined to them. It seeped into every corner of the house, affecting Chloe and even the neighbors. Claire Whitman, our overly inquisitive next-door neighbor, started commenting on how different things seemed around here. I'd catch her peeking through the blinds whenever I stepped outside, her face a mask of curiosity. "Daniel, is everything okay?" she asked one morning as I collected the mail. "Everything's fine," I replied with a forced smile. "Just some changes at home." She gave me a long look, clearly not convinced. "Well, if you ever need to talk?" I nodded and walked away, knowing full well that Claire's concern was just thinly veiled nosiness. Still, she might prove useful later. The real turning point came during a dinner party. Ryan had insisted on hosting one, probably in an attempt to assert his dominance over the house. He invited a few of his gym buddies, along with their equally obnoxious girlfriends. Mia went along with it, though her enthusiasm was noticeably muted. I stayed quiet throughout the evening, playing the role of the detached host. I let them laugh, drink, and act like they owned the place. But when Ryan suggested showing his friends the newly renovated basement, my blood ran cold. "Not a good idea," I said quickly, my voice steady but firm. Ryan looked at me with that infuriating smirk. "Why not? What are you hiding down there, Daniel?" "It's not finished," I lied. "Could be dangerous." He raised an eyebrow, but didn't push further. I could tell he didn't believe me, but he let it go for now. Later that night, after the guests had left, I caught Ryan sneaking toward the basement door. I stepped out of the shadows just as he reached for the handle. Looking for something? I asked, my voice low. He jumped, then recovered quickly. Just curious. I stepped closer, my presence looming over him. Curiosity can get you into trouble. For a moment, we locked eyes, the tension between us crackling like electricity. Then he smirked and backed away. Relax, Daniel. You're so uptight these days. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. My silence said everything. The next morning, Mia found a note taped to the bathroom mirror. Trust is fragile. Don't break it. It was written in her handwriting. Of course, I had been the one to write it, mimicking her style after years of seeing her pin shopping lists and notes for Chloe. When she confronted Ryan about it, he denied everything, accusing her of trying to mess with his head. The argument that followed was loud enough to wake Chloe, who came downstairs looking confused and worried. Why are you guys yelling? She asked, her voice small. Just grown-up stuff, Mia said quickly, forcing a smile. Chloe turned to me, her eyes pleading. I wanted to tell her everything, to let her know she wasn't imagining the chaos brewing in our home. But I couldn't. Not yet. The final straw came a few days later. I staged another small accident, deliberately jamming the basement door while Ryan was inside. He pounded on the door, yelling for someone to let him out. Mia rushed to help him, her voice tinged with panic. I let them struggle for a while before fixing the door. When Ryan emerged, his face red with anger, he turned to Mia. This is all your fault, he spat. None of this would have happened if you hadn't dragged me into this mess. Mia stared at him, stunned. My fault? Are you serious right now? Yes, he snapped. You wanted this. You wanted us. Now look where we are. I stood in the corner, watching their relationship crumble under the weight of their own lies. They had no idea that I was the one tightening the noose around their necks. And this was just the beginning. The night it all fell apart started like any other. Mia had cooked dinner, something elaborate, as if she were trying to prove she still belonged here. The scent of rosemary and garlic filled the air as she set the table, her movements almost robotic. Chloe had excused herself early, claiming she had homework, though I knew she just wanted to avoid the growing tension. I couldn't blame her. Ryan, of course, sat at the head of the table, holding court like some kind of self-appointed king. He regaled us with tales of his latest gym exploits, cracking jokes that only he seemed to find funny. Mia smiled dutifully, but her laughter felt forced, hollow. And me? I sat there silently, sipping my wine and watching the cracks in their facade grow wider. It started with a look. A fleeting glance Mia shot me across the table when she thought Ryan wasn't paying attention. It wasn't the look of a woman in love, or even one of apology. It was a look of fear. She knew something was coming. She just didn't know what. Everything okay, Mia? I asked casually, swirling the wine in my glass. She stiffened, her smile faltering. Of course. Why wouldn't it be? Ryan looked between us, suspicion flickering in his eyes. What's with the tension? He asked, leaning back in his chair. You two planning something without me? The irony of his question almost made me laugh. Instead, I shrugged. Nothing you'd be interested in. His smirk faded, replaced by a glare. What's that supposed to mean? Mia jumped in before I could answer. Can we not do this tonight? Please. But it was too late. Ryan's temper had been simmering for weeks, and now it was threatening to boil over. He slammed his fork down, the sound echoing in the otherwise quiet room. I'm sick of this passive-aggressive crap, he snapped. If you've got something to say, Daniel, just say it. I leaned back in my chair, meeting his gaze with an expression of calm I didn't feel. All right, I said, setting my glass down. Let's talk. The words came tumbling out before I could stop them. Not that I wanted to. I laid it all out. The texts, the photos, the years of lies. I told them I knew about the trips they'd taken, the money Ryan had funneled into secret accounts, the web of deceit they thought they'd so cleverly spun. By the time I was finished, Mia's face was ashen, and Ryan's fists were clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. You think you're so smart, he said through gritted teeth. You think you can intimidate me? I smiled coldly. I don't need to intimidate you, Ryan. You've done a fine job destroying yourself. He shot out of his chair so fast it nearly toppled over. You've got nothing on me. Oh, I've got plenty, I said, my voice low. And I'm not the only one who knows. Think about that the next time you walk into your office, or the gym, or anywhere really. For the first time, I saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Good. Let him stew in it. Mia, meanwhile, sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of the table like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Daniel, please, she whispered, her voice trembling. This doesn't have to go any further, doesn't it? I asked, turning to her. You made your choices, Mia. You chose him. Now you get to live with the consequences. She opened her mouth to respond, but Ryan cut her off. Don't beg him, he snarled. He's bluffing. Am I? I said, raising an eyebrow. You really want to test me, Ryan? Go ahead. The room fell silent, the air heavy with tension. Ryan glanced at Mia, then back at me, his bravado crumbling under the weight of his own insecurity. I should have broken your legs the moment you stepped onto my driveway, I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. But don't worry, I'm saving that for later. Ryan didn't take the bait, though I could see the effort it took to keep himself in check. Instead, he grabbed his plate and stormed out of the room, muttering curses under his breath. Mia stayed behind, her head bowed, tears streaming down her face. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean for it to go this far. I wanted to believe her, but the damage had been done. Sorry wouldn't fix this. It wouldn't bring back the trust, the love, the life we'd built together. You should have thought about that before, I said, my voice cold. Now it's too late. She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of guilt and desperation. But I didn't have time for her tears. Not anymore. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard them arguing in the guest room. Their voices were muffled, but I could make out enough to know that their perfect little partnership was falling apart. Ryan accused Mia of dragging him into this mess, while she blamed him for pushing me too far. I smiled to myself, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. Let them destroy each other. It saved me the trouble, because no matter how this ended, one thing was certain. They wouldn't leave this house together. Not if I had anything to say about it. The house felt different that morning. There was a heaviness in the air, a quiet tension that seemed to press against my chest with every breath. Ryan and Mia had spent the night behind closed doors, their hushed arguments seeping through the walls. I could tell they were nearing their breaking point, but I wasn't about to let them implode without my final say. I sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, pretending to scroll through my phone. The truth was, I wasn't looking at anything. I was waiting for one of them to come down, to make the first move, waiting for the moment I'd been building toward for weeks. It was Ryan who appeared first, his footsteps heavy on the stairs. He walked into the kitchen shirtless, his face a mix of anger and exhaustion. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He just grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter, glaring at me. You think you're clever, don't you? He said finally, his voice low and venomous. I set my phone down and met his gaze. I don't need to be clever, Ryan. I just need to be patient. His jaw tightened, and I could see the muscles in his arms flex as he gripped the glass. Whatever game you're playing, it ends now. I couldn't help but laugh, a short, bitter sound. You think this is a game? You walked into my house with my wife and declared it yours. Did you think I'd just roll over and let you have it? I didn't take anything you didn't already lose, he shot back, his smirk returning. Face it, Daniel. You weren't enough for her. The words stung, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. If I wasn't enough, why does she still flinch every time I look at her? Why does she cry herself to sleep at night? You might have won her body, Ryan, but her guilt? That's all mine. He slammed the glass on the counter, the sound echoing through the kitchen. You're pathetic. Do you know that? Clinging to some twisted sense of morality while your life crumbles around you. Maybe, I said, standing up slowly, but at least I can look in the mirror without hating what I see. Before Ryan could respond, Mia appeared in the doorway. She looked pale, her hair unkempt, her eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. She glanced between us, her expression wary, as if she'd walked into the middle of a battlefield. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Your husband," Ryan said, practically spitting the word, "thinks he can intimidate me." Mia's eyes flicked to me, pleading silently for some kind of truce. But I was long past caring about peace. "I'm not trying to intimidate you, Ryan," I said, my tone calm. "I'm just reminding you that actions have consequences." "Oh, spare me the lecture," he snapped, turning to Mia. "Tell him, Mia. Tell him he's lost. That this is our life now." But Mia didn't say anything. She just stood there, wringing her hands, her gaze fixed on the floor. That silence was louder than any words she could have spoken, and I saw the first flicker of doubt cross Ryan's face. "Unbelievable," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "You're actually scared of him, aren't you?" "I'm not scared," Mia said quickly, but her voice wavered. "Yes, you are," I said, stepping closer. "Not because I've threatened you, but because you know deep down that you've made a mistake. You chose him, Mia. You chose this. And now you're realizing it wasn't worth it." Her lip quivered, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. But then she squared her shoulders and looked at me with defiance. "You don't get to act like you're the victim here, Daniel. You weren't perfect either." "Maybe not," I admitted. "But I never betrayed you. I never walked away from our family. That was all you." Ryan stepped forward, placing himself between us. "That's enough," he said firmly. "This conversation is over." "No, Ryan," I said, locking eyes with him. "It's just getting started." He laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. "What are you going to do, Daniel? Call the cops? Sue us? Go ahead. Try. You'll only embarrass yourself." I smiled, a slow, deliberate grin that made him falter. "Oh, I've got something much better planned." His confidence wavered, just for a second, and I savored the moment. He didn't know what was coming, but he could feel the ground shifting beneath him, and that was exactly what I wanted. The confrontation ended with Ryan storming out of the house, slamming the door behind him. Mia stayed behind, her shoulders slumped, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and regret. She opened her mouth to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't," I said. "You made your bed. Now lie in it." She didn't argue. She just turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the remnants of our shattered lives. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty doorway. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal. It all swirled inside me, threatening to consume me. But I pushed it down. I couldn't afford to lose control. Not yet. Because this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The day I finally tipped the scales in my favor didn't feel monumental at first. It was quiet, unassuming, the kind of day that creeps up on you, disguised as ordinary. But by the time it ended, everything had changed. Mia had been avoiding me more than usual. She kept to her corner of the house, busying herself with meaningless tasks, her eyes darting away whenever they met mine. Ryan, on the other hand, had doubled down on his arrogance, strutting around the house like he owned it, as if his presence alone could erase the years of history etched into these walls. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that I had already set the final pieces of my plan into motion. It started that morning when Mia received an anonymous email. I knew the moment she opened it because I was watching her on one of the hidden cameras in the living room. Her face turned pale, her hands trembling as she read the words on the screen. I couldn't hear what was written, but I didn't need to. I had written it myself. Secrets have a way of surfacing. Be careful, Mia. Short, simple, but enough to send her spiraling. She closed the laptop quickly, glancing around the room as if someone might jump out of the shadows. I smiled to myself, watching her unravel in real time. Ryan's downfall, however, required a more direct approach. That afternoon, I accidentally left one of my old notebooks on the kitchen counter. It was a black leather-bound journal, one Mia had given me years ago for jotting down ideas for home projects. But what Ryan didn't know was that I'd filled the first few pages with carefully fabricated notes, details about his shady business dealings, connections to unsavory characters, and enough damning evidence to make even the most confident man squirm. I timed it perfectly. As I sat in the living room pretending to read, I heard the sound of pages flipping, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "What the hell is this?" Ryan demanded, storming into the room with the notebook in hand. I looked up calmly, feigning confusion. "What's what?" "This," he spat, holding up the notebook. "Where did you get this crap?" I shrugged. "Just some things I've come across over the years. Thought it might be useful someday." His face turned red, veins bulging in his neck. "You're bluffing. You don't have anything?" "Maybe," I said, standing and walking toward him. "But what if I do? What if I've got enough to ruin you? Your job, your reputation, your precious little image?" He opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, his jaw tightening. I could see the wheels turning in his head, the doubt creeping in. He didn't know if I was lying, and that uncertainty was all I needed. The real tipping point came that evening. Mia and Ryan were sitting on the couch, their tension palpable, when the doorbell rang. I had been expecting this. "I'll get it," I said, walking to the door with deliberate slowness. When I opened it, a man in a suit stood on the other side, holding a thick envelope. "Daniel Carter?" he asked. "That's me," I replied. He handed me the envelope and left without another word. I turned back to the living room, holding the envelope up for them to see. "What's that?" Ryan asked, his voice laced with suspicion. "Why don't we find out?" I said, tearing it open and pulling out the documents inside. I made a show of flipping through the pages, my expression growing darker with each one. "Interesting," I murmured, glancing up at them. "It seems someone's been moving money around. Large sums, in fact. Offshore accounts, fake charities, shell corporations. Ring any bells, Ryan?" His face went pale, and for the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "You're lying." "Am I?" I said, tossing the documents onto the coffee table. "Go ahead, take a look." He didn't move. Mia, however, reached for the papers, her hands shaking as she scanned the contents. Her gasp was audible, and she looked up at Ryan with tears in her eyes. "You said it was all under control," she whispered. "It is," Ryan snapped, but his voice lacked conviction. "It doesn't look like it," I said, leaning against the doorway. "In fact, it looks like things are about to get very messy for you, Ryan. And by messy, I mean criminal." The silence that followed was deafening. Ryan stood frozen, his mind racing for a way out, while Mia sank back into the couch, her face buried in her hands. I let the moment linger, savoring the weight of their realization. "This is just the beginning," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. "You thought you could walk into my house, take what's mine, and get away with it. But you underestimated me. That was your first mistake." Ryan looked at me, his eyes blazing with hatred. "You'll regret this." I smiled. "No, Ryan, you will." And with that, I walked away, leaving them to stew in their own misery. The scales had tipped, and now, it was only a matter of time before they crumbled entirely. The house had been quiet for hours, but it wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet. It was the kind of silence that carries weight, like the air before a storm. I knew it was coming, the final fracture in their fragile little partnership. I didn't have to push anymore. They were doing it to themselves now. I sat in the kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. The cameras I'd installed showed Mia pacing in the living room, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. Ryan was upstairs, locked in the guest room. They hadn't spoken since the documents I delivered detonated like a bomb in their lives. For the first time, I felt like the house was mine again. The collapse started when Ryan stormed downstairs, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He found Mia standing by the window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "You haven't said a word," he barked. "You're just going to let him play us like this?" Mia turned slowly, her face pale and tight with exhaustion. "What do you want me to say, Ryan? That you lied to me? That you dragged me into something I didn't sign up for?" He scoffed, throwing his hands up. "Oh, give me a break. You're no victim here. You knew exactly what you were doing when you left him for me." "I didn't know I was signing up for this," she snapped, her voice trembling. "The lies, the schemes, the constant looking over my shoulder. I thought," she stopped herself, biting her lip. You thought what? Ryan demanded. That this would be some fairy tale ending? That we'd just ride off into the sunset and live happily ever after? She didn't answer, but the silence was answer enough. I watched it all unfold from the security feed, my fingers drumming lightly against the countertop. Their words were cutting deeper now, the veneer of civility cracking and splintering. I had to admit, I'd underestimated how quickly they would unravel. You know what your problem is? Ryan said, stepping closer to her. You're weak. You've always been weak. That's why you couldn't make it work with him, and that's why this is falling apart. Mia flinched, tears welling in her eyes. I left him because I thought I deserved better, she whispered. But now, I'm not so sure. Her words hit him like a slap. For a moment, Ryan stood frozen, his jaw working as if he were struggling to form a response. Then, without warning, he lashed out, knocking a vase off the side table. It shattered on the floor, the sound reverberating through the house. That's it, he said, his voice a low growl. You think you can just walk away from this? From me? I don't know what I think anymore, Mia said, her voice breaking. But I know I can't keep doing this. That was the moment I decided to intervene. I pushed back my chair and walked into the living room, my steps deliberate. They both turned to look at me, their expressions a mix of anger, fear, and something else. Resignation? Maybe. Am I interrupting? I asked, my voice calm. Ryan glared at me. This has nothing to do with you. I raised an eyebrow. Really? Because it seems to me that this has everything to do with me. Mia looked at me, her tears spilling over. Daniel, I held up a hand, cutting her off. Save it, Mia. You've made your choices. Now, it's time to deal with the consequences. Ryan stepped toward me, his fists clenched. You think you're so smart, don't you? But this isn't over. I smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that I knew would infuriate him. Oh, it's over, Ryan. You just don't realize it yet. As I turned to leave, I heard Mia whisper something, so quiet I almost missed it. I'm sorry. I paused, glancing back at her. You're not sorry, Mia. Not yet. But you will be. I walked upstairs, leaving them alone in the wreckage of their crumbling alliance. The collapse was inevitable, but watching it unfold was even more satisfying than I'd imagined. The house was mine again, and soon, they'd both be gone for good. It was all leading to this moment. Every calculated step, every whispered doubt I had planted, every subtle move that tightened the noose around them. It all came down to this. The pieces of the game were in place, and now, it was time to tip the board. I spent the day in quiet preparation, ensuring everything was ready. The documents, the cameras, the backup plans, they were all aligned, waiting for the final trigger. Ryan and Mia had been circling each other like wounded animals, their arguments escalating to a fever pitch. I didn't need to poke the fire anymore. It was already consuming them. By the evening, the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for the storm to break. Ryan was in the living room, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. Mia sat on the couch, her knees drawn to her chest, her face pale and tear-streaked. I entered the room slowly, deliberately, making sure they felt the weight of my presence. Daniel, Mia said, her voice trembling, what are you doing? I ignored her, instead focusing on Ryan. It's time, I said simply, pulling a small envelope from my pocket and tossing it onto the coffee table. What the hell is this? Ryan demanded, snatching up the envelope and tearing it open. His eyes scanned the contents, his expression shifting from confusion to fury. Evidence, I said, crossing my arms. Of every dirty deal, every shady transaction, every lie you've told to get ahead. Enough to ruin you completely. You son of a... Ryan lunged toward me, but I stepped back, raising a hand. Careful, I warned. The police will be here any minute. You don't want to add assault to the charges. Mia's head snapped up, her eyes wide. Police? Daniel, what are you talking about? I turned to her, my expression cold. This is the end, Mia. You brought him into my house, into our lives. You let this happen. And now, you're going to face the consequences. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder as they approached. Ryan's face twisted with panic, and for the first time, I saw the cracks in his bravado give way to raw fear. "You can't do this," he hissed. "You don't have the guts." I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. "This isn't about guts, Ryan. It's about justice." The doorbell rang, and I moved to answer it. Two officers stood on the porch, their expressions professional but firm. "Daniel Carter?" one of them asked. "That's me," I said, stepping aside to let them in. "He's in the living room." The next few minutes were a blur. Ryan tried to argue, tried to bluster his way out of it, but the officers weren't having it. They cuffed him and read him his rights, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Mia watched in stunned silence, her hands covering her mouth. When the door closed behind the officers, she turned to me, her voice barely a whisper. "Why?" "Because you left me no choice," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "You could have walked away, Mia. You could have stopped this, but you didn't." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she shook her head. I thought we could fix it." "It's too late for that," I said, turning away. "You made your bed. Now lie in it." As the sound of the police car faded into the distance, I stood in the silence of the house, letting the weight of it all settle over me. It wasn't joy I felt, or even relief. It was something darker, something heavier. I had won, but at what cost? The house was quiet now, truly mine again. But as I stood there, staring at the empty doorway, I couldn't shake the feeling that some part of me had been lost in the battle. Mia's soft sobs echoed faintly from upstairs, a reminder of what had been and what could never be again. I didn't go to her. I couldn't. This wasn't a victory. It was an ending, and I would have to learn how to live with it.